Welcome to the World Wild podcast, and I'm Miles Irving. Just got back from a trip to Wales in which I managed to record a conversation with Bruce Parry, who did the Tribe series. All being well, that should be out next week. And but my main purpose in going to Wales was for the Association of Foragers annual meetup, where we have foragers coming from mostly Great Britain and Ireland, but we do always have Łukasz Ruchaj coming over from Poland. He's probably one of the most consistent attendees. So it's a great gathering. Lots of food cooked and lots of chats and things like forage basket making. And there's even a chap came that showed us how to make Bronze Age axes. So that was a good trip. On the way there, I managed to fit in a conversation with David Benjamin Blower, who's this week's guest. And we've been trying to hook up and have a chat face to face for some time. So being constrained by train times and things like that, it ended up that I could only have this conversation at Birmingham New Street train station. So we found the quietest corner we could, and you'll think when you listen that we didn't try very hard because you can clearly hear the coffee machine in the background. But there we are. In the general principle of the podcast being to document actual conversations I have, I thought we would just go ahead and use this material, even though we are very clearly sitting in a busy cafe, and the nature of the sound quality reflects that. But it is a chat that I did have with an actual person in my actual life, and that's what I'm trying to document here. Yeah, so I'll introduce you to David. David is sort of got a few different hats. He actually does a podcast himself called Nomad Podcast. We'll provide a link for that. He is something of a traveling minstrel. He did a wonderful album last year called We Really Existed and We Really Did This, which is kind of exploring the idea of the distinct possibility that we may go extinct and then some other intelligent life at some point would discover evidence of our existence and just stand in complete wonder and bewilderment that we were the author of our own demise, as it were. So yeah, it's an incredible piece of work. Lots of readings and songs alternated between the readings, exploring the idea of collapse, climate change, extinction, and a sort of faith and theological position coming out of that, which is quite profound. So that points to another aspect. David does some theology work around sort of political theology mainly, which is pretty interesting, exploring the nature of law and power and various other things. So that's it. He's a podcast guy, traveling minstrel, theologian, and jolly nice chap. So we'll get to the conversation shortly. It has provoked some ideas in the meantime for me, and I thought I'd like to share those. So I spoke to my sister, whose name is Alice, recently, and she just related a podcast that she'd been listening to that was sort of juxtaposing the sort of micro and the macro spheres of action, and that got me thinking. Apparently, this guy was saying he only believes in the micro level, and I started thinking, well, it'd be great if governments legislated about carbon emissions and things like that. That would get things on the right track. But then I thought, well, hang on a minute. The only reason we need legislation on that basis is because at the micro level, people's individual decisions linked up to other people's individual decisions, i.e., the consensus we reach with others about the kind of life we're going to live. Because we're allowing that to be dictated from a top-down basis, it means that we're basically going along with. So we are, collaborating with this system, which from the top down is supporting, an economics based on oil, economics based on greed, all of these kind of things. We are basically complicit with it. So that made me think, well, perhaps that guy's right, that we have to concentrate on this micro level and begin to weave a new kind of society, one that is based on at the micro level, every decision being kind of treasured, cradled, and just seen as very, very important, because we understand that all of those small decisions about how we live have very important ramifications. But from there, I went on to think, well, hang on a minute. Well, actually, I was chatting this over with Joel, who edits the podcast, and he pointed out that that puts an enormous burden of responsibility on the individual. And that means that actually it's a very untrue to life as it has always been. So we're in this situation now where like the onus is on us to make all these decisions about the basic infrastructure of life, where our food comes from, where everything comes from, and how we interact with that. But, at no other time has there been such a responsibility that like the onus would be on us to basically redesign everything, start from scratch and say, I'm not going to do it like that, I'm going to do it like this. So that sort of feeds into the idea that there's a kind of collective responsibility where, because okay, so the whole point of everything that's being said on this podcast is to point towards the basic characteristics of nurturance and how the fabric of life is intricately and intimately woven together and gives rise to this support, this nurturance and holding of carrying of life, of species being settled into ecosystems and supported by ecosystems, but individuals, individual people or individual animals or trees or whatever also being nurtured and supported by this massive interconnectivity. So in the absence of that interconnectivity, as isolated individuals, we can't be responsible for weaving again the fabric of life that's broken down. It must be that we need to find that nurturance in order to make any decisions that we do. So I just thought from that kind of starting point about what it really would take to get things back on track, where we would need to go. And the train of thought I had was really prompted by something I've been reading just this morning. I'm reading a book called Aware by Dan Siegel. This is Aware, the Science of Presence. And in that, he talks about an emergent property of complex systems. So without being able to go very deeply into that train of thought, I will just quickly say that the idea in complexity theory is that lots of different things get linked together in lots of different ways. And the more complex that linkage is and the better quality the links themselves are, lots of really good quality links between lots of different things. At a certain point, something called an emergent property arises, i.e. something arises from that system of connectivity, which couldn't have been predicted in any way by all of the different parts that are lumped together. It is more than the sum of its parts. In other words, the whole is more than the sum of its parts and gives rise to something above and beyond those parts. And the best examples of that are the emergence of life from complex organic chemistry, and then the emergence of consciousness from more and more complex arrangements of a diversity of nerve cells connected in different ways, eventually gave rise to consciousness, which couldn't have been predicted from just the fact of a lot of nerve cells being joined together. But what Dan Siegel says in this passage that I was reading this morning is that self-organization is an emergent property of living systems. And that really speaks into the conundrum that I've just alluded to. So they have individuals feeling responsible to sort of redesign the system, as it were. Whereas what this is saying is that if we have massive and high quality connectivity between elements of a system, and in this case we're talking about people making a better society and so on, if we get the connectivity happening, then the emergent property of that system will be self-organization. So this is really speaking in favor of the micro level of activity, but not putting the burden of responsibility on the shoulders of the individuals to somehow come up with a better system, because that's, actually that speaks to an idea of effort and control, which is quite against the idea of being cradled and nurtured by the fabric of life, as it were. So what we see is that the onus or the responsibility is fundamentally to seek out that kind of connectivity. That if we connect together, then in many different ways with many different people, and there's lots of connectivity between groups and so on that are kind of searching out these ideas and these better ways of living. It's that connectivity which will give rise to an emergent property of self-organization. And I think that probably links very well to kind of anarchist philosophies that are saying no to government, but they're not really saying no to government. They're saying no to this imposed form of coercive state government, whilst at the same time pointing to the fact that if people are left to their own devices, they form linkages and they organize and develop, for example, ways of managing the common resources by consensus and discussion and so on. So that I found that train of thought I found quite helpful, but it did point me to something else or something above and beyond that, to look at the kind of self-organizing system that we need at the moment, above and beyond us learning to have a good society, considering humans on their own. But obviously the real problem is that we do not have a good society in which human beings are citizens of the biosphere, as it were, important members of the biosphere in a way that is functional and beneficial. Obviously, at the moment, the way that we interact and engage with the biosphere is very destructive, not just for the biosphere, but for ourselves. So the conclusion I came to thinking about that was that we need, most of all, we need this connectivity between human culture and the biosphere. We need to find linkages that integrate us back in with living systems, and that linkage needs to be many, many, many. Like we need to find ways that all sorts of aspects of our daily life, from the point we wake up to the point we go to sleep, or indeed maybe there's ways we could be linking to land better when we're asleep. Who knows? But we need, as individuals, to be linking up with landscapes and ecology, and we need the way that we relate to other people to involve linkages with land and ecology. Because what I'm kind of envisaging or dreaming about, I guess, in saying this, is that the emergent property of self-organization kicks in, whereby people and land, we don't have to be thinking about does this decision do this to the greenhouse gas levels or whatever, because we've woven something which has this emergent property of self-organization. Having concentrated on building linkages, cultural linkages with land, then we arrive at that point. So I'm not sure how clearly I've managed to convey what I'm trying to say there, but hopefully you'll be able to tease some meaning out of it, because it does tie into some of the themes I explore with David. Okay, so let's get on with the chat with David now.
It's funny that so often the what's talked about as the big headache is it's going to be much harder to import and export food now that we've left, which is true, and that's a shame. I kind of want to move towards not having to import and export so much food, and maybe just eating what's around. So it's not really the rationale on which I voted to remain.
No,
it's other things. I sort of, the arguments given for leaving and the arguments given for remaining, neither of those felt like my tribe really.
Interesting. Right. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the arguments for leaving were, faintly xenophobic or outright racist, or just like an anxiety about free movement of people in one form or another. That's not something I don't want to be part of that really. But then the arguments given for remaining, and I voted to remain, was so often it was wanting to be part of a big capitalist block where you're able to move stuff, miles and miles and miles without too much trouble.
Yeah.
I'm all for sort of good trade deals, but I mean, I didn't vote to remain for a capitalist ideal. I wanted to be part of nations that collaborate towards the common good. But it was all sort of economic fear mongering on the Remain side. That was that was the sort of the big narrative coming from the powers, wasn't it? Also, I feel like it's a big anxiety kind of thing. It's like nation state as a political paradigm is kind of collapsing. So there's that anxious reaching for the past and trying to build the strongest nation state with the strongest borders and the biggest walls that you can. There's this kind of anxiety about a paradigm that's passing because the world just doesn't work that way now. Everyone's quite anxious about how it will work and so on. Most of all, I hope that there's just something else on the news than Brexit for a while. There won't be, will there? It'll just be talking about how it's all panning out. And then I don't know how long it'll be before this just seems like foolishness, like really not. I don't know, it won't be that long, I don't think, before we look back and say, this was really not the most important thing happening in 2018, 19, 20.
Yeah. I guess the great thing is all the Extinction Rebellion stuff and everything else that's pushed climate change far more into the centre of people's awareness has happened in spite of it. It's amazing that has happened. But at the same time, it's meant that it's just highly unlikely to get it to the top of the political agenda because of Brexit. So the man in the street, I think, is far more tuned into the fact that we are basically screwed if we don't do something about that. And I think that's shifted enormously in the last 12, 18 months. Just, everybody's far more. Do you agree? Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the last 12 months. I mean, I remember, the first Extinction Rebellion actions were last spring, weren't they?
Yeah.
Were they the first ones? I mean, that was the first kind of big push. I remember that.
Last spring. You mean
last April? Oh no, 2019.
No, they were going in 2018.
Right.
First ones, I think, were like October, November.
Were you tuned in back then?
I just had friends that went.
Yeah.
And there was a little bit of activity in Canterbury, so that there were posters and flyers.
I remember late 2018 hearing that Rowan Williams had kind of signed, one of the signatories saying, "Time for mass civil disobedience is now."
Well, Rowan Williams, back in the day, when he was still Archbishop, he went, I forget if it was a year but he refused to fly anymore, trying to keep up with his itinerary as Archbishop of Canterbury. So he's having to just not go or catch a boat. He said it was incredibly hard.
Yeah.
But, I mean, that back in the day, I mean, unfortunately, it's contrast in that in terms of bishops and so on. I'm just rereading Tom Wright, for anyone listening, he was Bishop of Durham at some point, from 2012, and he's talking about the church's responsibility to engage with ecological issues, and he doesn't mention climate change from the beginning to end of the book.
Hey.
He mentions acid rain, and he mentions deforestation, I think. I mean, that's what's clicked for me in the last 12 months, to be honest. I've gone into numbness about climate change until quite recently. I stopped really thinking about things that I was really banging on about 5 or 6 years previously.
Yeah.
I just got into numbness, thinking, well, we're all just in this boat, it's going to sink, and I guess I was just blanking it out. But in the last 12 months, I've got really okay, it does look like there might be some value.
So you know what? Sorry, carry on.
Well, just in a collective, getting all stirred up about it because it might lead to something.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. And I've been we're all sort of retrospectively learning about it now, aren't we? I was learning a bit about the first IPCC report, which was 1990, I think, or 91, something like that, 30 years ago, basically. And that was the first time there was a big collective report from scientists commissioned by... was it by the UN? Yeah, I think it was the UN who commissioned it, isn't it? And that's the point at which there was a sort of widespread agreement in the scientific community. The climate's changing. These are the reasons. These are the possible outcomes. It really, really, really could be really bad. That's 30 years ago. And it is just, speaking for myself, it's the last year and a half when it's found its way into my head and my heart. So there is this sudden acceleration happening right now. I don't know why. But it's very interesting to watch that happen en masse, isn't it? To watch people as a mass engaging with new emotional realms of possibility and catastrophe, and especially in a situation where it's not like, we're here in a cafe in Birmingham, England. It's not. We're not feeling the brunt of it, That's it. We're not. That's it. Yeah, but it's that kind of recognition that something's coming. I guess there's something almost prophetic about it, isn't there? Something Jeremiah-esque about that kind of. What do you do when all the evidence says that everything's about to change in really alarming ways, but you haven't hit it yet? You get normalcy bias, don't you? You get or you grate with your normalcy bias. You assume that tomorrow will be like today, just because today is like yesterday. It's a very weird time, very interesting time.
Shall I tell you something that I observed? Earnestness is now okay. Yeah. For a long while, you weren't allowed to be earnest. That was deeply uncool. You just had to be ironic self. If you got at all kind of serious, like it actually meant something, you then have to make a joke to kind of.
Yeah, no, sort of constant irony is a bit of a cultural mark of empire, I think, isn't it? It's that layer of nothing really matters, everything's a joke, because you're removed from the consequences of everything by a few steps, and you sort of cope with that awkwardness by just making a joke out of everything. Yeah, getting to the point where you can't do that in the same way. I don't know what's possible in terms of what happens from here. When you encounter a time when there is sort of a mass realisation of the weight of the time, does that give me hope? It does, but I don't know hope for what. I'm still not certain of how much power we have to change the structures we live in, even once we've realised that they're killing us. I'm almost more impressed by our ability to continue doing things we know are killing us, just because we don't know how to take the machine apart. We don't seem to operate with it at that level. We're going to have to think and work really, really fast to be able to make that kind of scale of change happen. Part of me thinks we're not really good at changing until things actually hit the fan, you know?
My perspective is a little bit different. I just think the key to sorting this all out is not freaking out about climate change, even though that does alert us to the fact that things ought to be different. I do think that hanging over us and loads of other cultural factors at the moment mean that we are in a state of flux, where there is a suspension of the usual rules to a certain extent, i.e. people are open to being told this way of living doesn't actually cut it, and there is a completely different way of doing things over here, whether that's yoga or...
Yeah.
And I think the thing that is probably could be most powerful is just to point out that people are eating bread that doesn't satisfy. Because, damn it, I don't care how caught up in the machine people are. It's not that hard to just notice that you're not satisfied. Do you feel good? Do you feel grounded? Do you feel belonging? Do you feel purposeful? And I think that's the opening. To not actually to dismantle the machine, but to walk away from it. Because to me, the issue is that we've got this juxtaposition of machine and organism. But damn it, we are an organism. So the organism wins until we become cyborgs, and there's a whole lot, and there's a lot of cyborgy things happening now. I like the fact that we're glued to screens and we can't move anywhere without a machine. We're getting cars and planes and things like that, where we used to just move in our soft, wonderful bodies with the structures to hold us upright and propel us forward, and eyes and gaze to navigate and so on. Used to be the way that we did as an animal, like the other ones, Now, so many of these things, getting all the stuff that we need all day is made by machines instead of weaving and foraging and cooking and so on. But, damn it, we're still an organism for all of that. We are not machines yet. We are being encroached upon in all sorts of ways by machines. But we are actually still an organism. I think that noticing that we're not satisfying is point number one. That's still true, because if there was an issue of satisfaction becoming a non-issue, then we'd be a machine by now.
I think I share that hope, and in a way, times of collapse are the most fertile times for letting go, for new things, or even the recovery of old things to happen. I think that is the hopeful thing for me at this point. I suppose my uncertainty is whether that as a means of avoiding collapse, I'm not hopeful about that. I almost feel like the collapse is necessary. I'm not kind of rubbing my hands together about it. I'm hopeful that a recovered human life is possible, out of what falls apart. But I suppose I'm fascinated by these transitional moments in history where, the way the world works just fractures and falls apart and doesn't work anymore because things have changed, things have moved on. The weight of its foolishness just takes it to breaking point. And that just happens in cycles in human history, doesn't it? And there is that sense that each one of those collapses is a little bit more catastrophic than the one before, because
we've got better at it.
Yeah, we've got better at
now
balls and shit up. Yeah.
Now with that global catastrophe.
The most awesome collapse
and mass extinction
human history's ever seen. Yeah. Well, that's it. So the first time we've called one of these a mass extinction. There's been mass extinction events, but I think this is the first one that's
by one species. I think there was one caused by one massive asteroid.
Right, yeah.
Never one species.
I know, all that stuff blows my mind. Is this the fifth or the sixth one? I can't remember. But there is an arc to these things where the hubris of however many hundred years before just stacks up. I think really we're paying the price for what was rotten about the Enlightenment from the start. Yeah, I'm so unenthusiastic about progress and Enlightenment and so on. Not because knowledge is a bad thing or science or these are beautiful things, but it was inseparable, in its inception from Eurocentric exceptionalism, colonialism, greed, pride, capitalism. The way Francis Bacon would talk about science was just horrifying. He'd talk about nature with this horrible kind of rapey language, like putting nature on the rack and penetrating it and making it yield its secrets. It's just like absolutely horrifying and foul. But I mean, those are the really messed up words of somebody from hundreds of years ago. But that's exactly what. Now we're really paying the price, because that's what we've been doing and we're still doing it. We're treating nature with that kind of abusive loathing, and sooner or later that comes back, and that's now. I don't think that goes away quietly.
I mean, I was rebuked kind of in a very sort of underhand way by a guy I met in Australia who's worked with Aboriginal elders for about 25 years. Just slowly, painstakingly getting their knowledge down in different ways, which is a depressing thing in itself. The only reason he's doing that is because their culture has gone in. They wouldn't need him to do that. It wasn't for the fact that the kids don't want to take it on and so on. So he's getting it down in their own language, paid by the government to do so, which is kind of nice. But anyway, we're out there driving out to this community. We get to see some of the plants and see how they use them and whatnot. But he says, indigenous people, he said they're just there doing what they're doing today. They just do what they're doing, and that's the world they're living. But of course, you have an idea, don't you? And that's the difference. And I'm like, there's me kind of thinking, yeah, but my idea is how to kind of help these guys to get another white dickhead. Come on. You have an idea, don't you? Well, yeah, but
you're the ideas guys.
You looked at my idea. It's quite a good one.
Oh, fairly said.
I said, no, you're right, Glenn. I said, yeah, I've been thinking. He said, yeah, that's the trouble.
I love the Greek word metanoia. Yeah, which appears in our Bibles as repentance. Sounds very religious and grovelling and wretched. Metanoia, sort of over knowing, thinking again, scratching your head, looking back and thinking, oh, it wasn't a very good idea, was it?
So that's the opposite to the other kind of overthinking then.
Yeah.
You can overthink something or you can overthink something.
Yeah, it's like, there's overthinking, but I think this is more thinking over.
Thinking over.
Yeah. So it's about relinquishment, isn't it? It's putting down your... And it's that vision of, like, we're so addicted to our idea, or to the way, the way that we've done it, or the brilliant idea we had, because it was such a good idea when it started. So, this is that moment for us, isn't it, of relinquishing, putting down... We're finding it so hard to contemplate putting down our energy systems, our economic systems, our food systems, our systems, all the systems. So it's a time of opening up the fingers and mournfully letting something go, isn't it? And that'll be good. It will be a good thing.
Got a line in your song that I really like, the Hands in the Soil song. says brothers to the edges, sisters to the leverage, or the other way around. Sisters to the leverage, which way around is it?
Yeah, can't remember. Yeah, that's the.
Where does that fit into this conversation?
I mean, the Francis Bacon words just say it all for me. There's another one of us, white European men, with an idea, and his language for describing it is so patriarchal. Not just patriarchal, but psychopathic, sociopathic, sexually abusive, rapey. The feminine is absolutely seen as an object of use, an object of knowledge, that a means to an end, a thing for the male desire, male want, male hubris. I don't know, working in the theological world, it's interesting seeing people rethink their theological language and work and vision in this regard. What patriarchal power, male power, the process of putting that down and stepping aside and being silent, making a quiet space for the women among us to speak and not be interrupted or corrected or shouted over, or even met with the howls of agreement from men that really are ways of the men saying, yeah, I already thought that. There are so many levels on which that needs to happen that it's, I despair of where to begin. We just have to begin.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about that Bacon thing, or the overall approach, because I think it's a mistake in the first place, because the idea that something needed to be taken. It's like the Aboriginal Australians, people went there busy taking their land, and yet they'd be going across the desert, dying of thirst and starving, and refused to engage with Aboriginal people. But they would leave food outside their tent, kept them alive as they travelled across the desert. Many people, whose land has been taken and still looked after because they felt that hospitality and duty of care to someone that was in their land. And I kind of feel like it's a bit like a delusional thing. So it's like you, as my father, but just pretend you gave me that $5 and it was still $5 and you gave it to me, and then I ran over there and told my mate that suck up blow, I managed to nick a $5 from him. You know what I mean? Because I'm deluded. I don't understand what's just happened. Just given a $5. But my mindset is not, I don't like this man being kind of letting people give me stuff for anything. But I managed to really tell the story in a way that I honestly believe it's true. So I think science is the land very kindly enabling us to understand how things work so that we can get on in them. It's just that she, as it were, is so benign that she, even knowing that we're going to do what we're going to do, she still says, here you go, this is how it all works. And then we rush up going, I nicked a $5 from her, and we do all this terrible stuff. Whereas, I believe science is just like all of the indigenous knowledge. Homo sapiens for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, I've always heard land telling us how things work and what to do. But when we were in this reciprocal relationship, we were very grateful. Thank you so much for the money. I might just have a cup of tea. I really appreciate that. And we would be reverent, thankful, and careful to reciprocate this duty of care. Land's told us what to do, we'll make sure that we look after it with this knowledge about what to do. And I think we're getting there now with some of the stuff that's coming out. We can have this kind of anti-science critique when we look back to those guys. But we look at what's going on now with scientific insights into the gut flora and what's going on underneath the soil, for example. Views into the unseen realm that are showing us how remarkable, wonderful, interrelated and non-hierarchical everything is, and makes us realise that, if we follow these wonderful lessons, we'll be thriving and flourishing. So it kind of, if we'd have hung with these initial insights that made everything look a bit cause and effecty and linear causality and so on, which came out of the early Enlightenment times, so they gave rise to crude machines, But if we had not been boys with our toys allowed to just run riot, It was all the other factors in play at the time that meant that those kind of discoveries became like deadly weapons in the hands. You know, I mean, it's better analogy would be putting a machine gun in the hand of a 3-year-old, but but the thing is, it didn't need to be a machine gun, sort of, if that analogy works. But the very same thing that ended up being so destructive. If we'd have just hung with it for a while and tinkered around and said, okay, well, what's the implications of this and so on? Which is what any land-based culture would have done. That's another weird, you know, it's like the conservatism of those cultures was a thing that meant, you know, and we have to relearn that conservatism, i.e., don't just go storming ahead.
Yeah. I was reading, what's the book? The Human Planet. I can't remember who the two writers are. How We Created the Anthropocene.
Right.
So there's two scientists making the argument for a new geological age triggered by human activity.
Yeah, I've heard of this. I've not read it.
It's really good. It's very good. I suppose one of the reflections that was coming to me was that, like, at what point did we begin using this kind of extractive language?
Yeah.
Or thinking of ourselves as other from nature?
Yeah.
Rather than as part of it. I mean, we're part of the ecological whole, is the reality. It's a weird delusion that we're not. But it struck me that in order to think in an imperial way, if you want to colonise another place, first thing you have to do is separate yourself out from it as other, and then you can take it. Then you get that pleasure of taking the fiver and saying, I got the fiver. And so part of the process of that mindset of hubris necessitates you sort of separating yourself out as not the thing.
Self-alienation kind of.
Yeah, self-alienation, exactly that. And so then what does the process of reintegration look like? Where we say, well, there's a relationship of reciprocity, you know, with the earth and with us as creatures, because we're earth creatures. We belong to this ecological whole, but we're behaving as though we didn't. We're behaving as though it's inanimate stuff that is there for us to extract as a complete other. But that's such a huge shift for the the Western mindset and where it's gone. And I mean, I'd be interested to learn more about other parts of the human community and ways of viewing this. I mean, that's where that symbolism came from. Hands in the soil. You know, I was actually reading another Tom Wright book, second Tom Wright reference of the discussion, ding, where he was talking about symbolic practices of the early Messianic community. So rather than thinking in very religious concepts of sacrament and ritual and things that people would do in order to say who they were in the world. So you'd break bread, and it was a way of remembering the death of a peasant messiah and sort of a meal of solidarity, or you would get plunked underwater and pulled up again. It was a way of saying you died to the present political powers and you'd risen to a new imagination of the way the world could be. So
there's an idea of birth in there as well, isn't there? It must be like coming up out.
Yeah, rebirth, newness, resurrection, all these sorts of images. So I was contemplating what kind of symbolic practices feel important for human communities today. Like, we should put our hands in the soil, because I was looking for a symbolic practice that would enable us to sort of reintegrate, to recapture the imagination of being part of the ecological whole, the reality of it.
It's more than imagination. When you put your hands in the soil, you're getting bacteria on you that boost your immune system. It's been raining any time recently. There's things called phytoncides coming off that bacteria are produced that also boost your immune system and make you feel calm and lovely. So there's probably a whole bunch of other stuff goes on. But I think that's the key point. We're out. Well, we're still here. How's that look? How can you be out of this whilst we're here? But we're not here.
That's almost the saddest thing, isn't it? Yeah, feeling like you're not at home when you're at home.
When you're at home, it's like there being some kind of thing that means you can't touch someone, like they're right next to you, but you can't touch them. It's that non-contact, I mean, that is our issue. So I think that contact is the remedy. So like you saying, hands in the soil, I don't know, awakening to presence, I suppose, of of any kind, actually, because all presence is living stuff.
And I've heard you talking about, I've forgotten the phrase you used, but you were talking about our skin's an organ, and there's a point of contact in which we're porous with the stuff around us.
Membranes is something that I work around a lot, just thinking about it. Like any kind of point of contact we have, whether that is like through our senses, so, back of your eyes, inside of your ears, touching your skin inside your nose, on your lips and your tongue. All of these things are where you encounter signs coming in from outside. But of course, as soon as they hit those skin bits of you, the surface of you, they go through that and into your being, your felt experience, through your synapses and whatever, within your body. You become one with the outside's come in, and now your inside breathes out again, as it were, and you reflect what you've just experienced. You're now a product of what you've seen and heard, and products are lousy way. You're a child almost. Who you are next is the child of that sensory experience. And the same thing with breathing in, we're taking oxygen in from the outside and that's becoming us, and what's inside of us is coming out with CO2 and food passing through your gut. This is all of that is skin and the outside coming in, and and so on. But I think that's that is actually a reality and a metaphor. I'll explore it, but just as an aside, I'm increasingly thinking like it's the thing itself and the metaphor, and like it's almost like I don't know where one stops and I'm not sure it's supposed to. I'm increasingly convinced that like the indigenous worldview, they didn't see metaphor as being a different species of reality to what we're calling the thing itself. They didn't see it. It's totally blurred, and that's good, because kind of to work with metaphor, you kind of have to have that kind of sense of it being real that we lack. So it's just a metaphor. But anyway, this skin in-out thing, semi-permeable membrane, like the vital contact with our surroundings through getting the stuff you need from the place where you live. That's and that means I'm not going to check my phone because I'm talking to David. That sort of thing is also not getting what you need from the place where you live. We're constantly interacting with something elsewhere. Because we're experiencing the world through these communities. Obviously, there's a benefit to that, up to a point, But my question is, like, to what extent now does the stuff that we do for most of the hours that we're awake foster that vital living connection where we're touching what's around us vitally, and then the fact that we've eaten this, we've worn that, we've talked in this way instead of that way. I'm making fun movements there as if I'm texting, by the way. To what extent does all of those things that we've done in that 24-hour period foster these organic linkages that we're grounded and rooted in the organic world, instead of this weird world that we've created, really weird, alienated other world, which is mostly the product of machines, but it's actually the product of abstractions, thanks to Mr. Bacon and Mr. Descartes. They've created this other world that's no world, it's a nothing, it's a void. It's like, wow.
I think this is one of the threads that's created massive change and new awareness right now is our re-embodiment. We're connecting with our bodies and recognising ourselves as, and Western intellectual history is profoundly dualistic, isn't it? It's very, it's very sort of, there's spirit and there's matter, and they're very different.
Like the philosopher kings who get their good stuff from this other realm.
It's all very Platonic. It's so deep in sort of our sort of thought history, isn't it? But something happened, like when you sort of reconnect with your body, you also reconnect with your. And you recognise yourself as embodied. I am matter, But then once I engage with that, I immediately begin to recognise myself as being in situation, in place, like in a place.
Your body's how you connect to all this stuff. You're not in your body, you can't.
I'm not in my body nowhere. I'm in my body here. We're material. I remember reading Walter Brueggemann, old, theologian. Of the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible is sort of a theology book on the Old Testament. He says, like, Jewish religion is intensely materialistic. It's totally materialistic. I grew up in churches. Materialism was always the dirtiest word imaginable. It's that platonic idea that material is somehow a terrible thing that you're escaping from. But that's not really the kind of the Hebrew biblical imagination.
That's Gnosticism, isn't it?
Yeah. That's it. How do we get so Gnostic? It's fascinating. Yeah. So we're in recovery from this, and this is part of what. I don't know what comes first, chicken or the egg, but when you sort of begin to encounter an ecological crisis, when you begin to think about how dependent we are on the topsoil and the quality of it for everything we eat, when we begin to realise, how many days you can take without food, or all these sorts of things, you're put back in touch with the material miracle, the miracle of material life, how beautiful it is, how fathomless and extraordinary, and it's wonderful, and fills me with awe and sadness at what we do to it and how we disregard it. Yeah.
So for some reason we've been trained, part of this alienation is we ignore what's just, it's just like, we've got something, as you say, so wonderful, so beautiful, immediately present with us. If we can't get out in the forest, hey, you're in your body. That's also this beautiful thing. Phenomenally beautiful.
Yeah.
Body. We just manage to be still for a moment and just feel how good this feels. You don't need to go anywhere or do anything. It just feels so good to be in the body. On the whole, a body that's just a normal body. It feels so good to be in the body.
So I bet so many people don't feel that way, and it's this weird, there's this sort of mass trauma of being disconnected from our bodies as a sort of civilization in the West for so long that we're all desperately doing yoga to try and work out how to feel good in our bodies,
And yoga works is wonderful, but I often kind of end up thinking, hang on a minute, this is a remedial action. This is trying to get me to experience normal life.
Yeah.
A buffalo running about all day is totally in that zone permanently, apart from when being attacked and fight or flight kicks in very briefly. But because he's so in that zone, the rest of the lot are in the zone and he's on the land and everything like that, he just gets welcomed back into this state of loveliness almost immediately. So this is, as you say, mindfulness, yoga. At least we're doing that instead of taking drugs these days. That's an improvement, but
we're trying to sort of awaken ourselves out of our ignorance, aren't we? That's trying to wake up into our bodies.
Yeah, we're exploring and ignoring.
Sorry, this has been brief. I hope it's been worth it.
Great, we covered some ground. I'm going to turn it off.
So once again, thanks for joining us for this week's World Wild podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening to David. There will be a link to 2 versions of his album that I mentioned. The We Really Existed and We Really Did This. He's just redone it, an acoustic version where he does extended readings between the songs, and I believe that's available as a download for a $5, which is a pretty good deal. And I didn't quite finish telling you about the travelling minstrel bit. So I've told you that David's a musician and has made this album. He's made a lot of albums prior to that. But the really fun thing is he did a tour of living rooms this year performing that album. And I was privileged to be in quite a large living room in a big house in Sussex last year to see that in action. It was fantastic. So I'm not sure if David's planning to continue the living room tour business, but he certainly travels around and plays his songs. So do click on the links and explore that. Also, we'll put the link to the Association of Foragers once again. All these links are on the Forager website where the podcast is hosted. Just click the link to podcasts on the Forager website. And the Association of Foragers website will enable you to find a forager near you. Certainly if you're in the British Isles and in parts of Europe. I think we've got one at least in Australia. We have members all over the world, so it's well worth exploring that. Okay, that's it for this week's World Wild podcast.
Put your hands in the soil Feel the groan and feel the joy. All sit with the hurt, stare into the dirt. Occupy the bandstands, gather lost citizens. Climb down your pyramids, relinquish your privilege. Welcome strangers to your table, as though they were angels. Make space for the spent, feel the lament. Break your vows to the powers, plant trees and grow flowers. Share the resources, free all the horses. All citizens, put your hands in the soil and feel the growth. Can you feel the joy? And be still, and be still. Down by the riverside, who's not afraid to die? Emerge from the waves, broken loose from the powers of the age. Live now as citizens of what's left of the age to come. Behold the Messiah dying for the lands we're crucifying. Break bread and take drink, all feel and think. Shed tears every day for everything we throw away. Mourn for your families, mourn for your enemies. Sing to the stars, console our grieving hearts. All citizens, put your hands in the soil and feel the growth. Can you feel the joy? And be still, and be still. Clap your hands to your mouth, let your pride go south. Put your hand on your head, make terms with the dead. Put your hands on your face, too late to learn from our mistakes. Put your hand on your heart, can we stop what we start? Sisters to the leverage, brothers to the edges, youth to the fore. This bleak future is yours. All ye of noble bone, join the scum of the earth. Gather round the powerless, there's the power that can save us. All citizens, put your hands in the soil and feel the growth. Feel the joy and be still, 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 and be still.